I'd like to welcome all of you to this extraordinary event, which is usually once a year, even though Professor Ravindra gives other lectures in other places, but he comes here this one time, which is very auspicious. Thank you very much, sir. And so it's really wonderful to see all of you, and thank you for contributing to this. And also, I want to give you a practical thing. There's water and so on in the kitchen area back there. Help yourself. There are several restrooms, one around the corner to the right, but also one down the corridor to the left. And let's see, should I say anything else? You all know Ravi. I don't know what to say about Ravi that you don't know, other than that he is a most precious friend. I met him over 40 years ago, right? When Krishnamurti was still alive. And then, by the way, Krishnamurti was very fond of Ravi. Particularly, there's one event. Sorry to take the stage for just a moment. There was one event that was very auspicious, and we had a lunch, and Ravi was here and partook in our discussions and so on, and I was the cook. So I was sitting there at the lunch table, not too far from Krishnaji and Ravi, and at one point they were talking, and at one point Ravi says to Krishnaji, he says, "You know, sir, you really are an engineer of the interior." And Krishnaji, sort of, he never particularly cared for praise and all that. And he just sort of looked at Ravi, and gave a little smile and nodded, but he was very pleased with that. And I think it was engineer, wasn't it?
Scientist of the interior.
Okay, there you go, my memory. Scientist of the interior. So that was a good description of Krishnamurti. So thank you again for coming, and I hand over the word and panel to Ravi. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I should say, even though this is already slightly contradictory to Krishnamurti's advice, who always suggested we should be in the present moment, but being in this room, it is very difficult for me not to remember many events in which I had extended conversations with him in this room. So, even though this is not entirely the thing he would recommend for me to talk about, but I didn't always agree with him in any case. Let me first of all make a few general remarks. I know some of you, in fact it seems many of you have been hearing me for quite a few days at Kratona, so for some of you these may be repeated remarks, but not everybody has been there. So these are generalizations of necessity. Whenever one makes a large general remark, there is a lot of finesse. So it's not so much a matter of arguing about this or that. I'm making a larger kind of comment. And if it feels wholly wrong to you, then it'll be worth giving more details. But otherwise, for example, as far as I can learn from any scriptures I have read or any of the sages I have met, including Krishnaji, one common lesson from all these sages and scriptures is, as long as I remain the way I am, I cannot come to the truth. or to God, or to the real, or the absolute, whatever other labels appeal to you from the perspective of whatever one in one's destiny, or in one's deepest mind, or even in imagination may be aiming at. We may call it God, not knowing what exactly it is we mean by this, but something sometimes calls people. So this is the one common lesson, as far as I know. And also, I would request to everybody here, I will end up making quite a few general remarks. If you actually know any exception to this, I'm delighted to learn. Just because it is my folly, I'm not committed to it. I'm happy to change. So if you know any exception to the remarks I made one, that this is the one single lesson of all the teachings, all the scriptures, all the sages. Naturally, the phraseology varies. What is recommended is a radical transformation of one's whole being. Body, mind, spirit, emotions. It is sometimes referred to as a new birth is required. This is the expression, for example, Christ has in speaking to Nicodemus. Sometimes it is expressed different languages, different phraseology. One has to die to oneself. Or another remark of Christ, this is in Gospel of Matthew, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. That a second birth is required, a spiritual birth, in addition to the birth of flesh that we all have. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. This is a common call. Naturally, the phraseology varies. Sometimes it is very strongly expressed, like dying to oneself. Sometimes not so strongly. But the general idea is that a radical transformation is required. Then any serious teaching, one of the things which is very strongly recommended as a fundamental journey, fundamental path, even by those who insist that there is no path to the truth. For example, Krishnamurti, even they highly recommend that it is very necessary to undertake serious self-inquiry. It's not a good idea to call it a path under these circumstances here, but journey, direction, undertaking, requirement, any other phrase we may use. Now, this is where one needs to be very careful about phraseology. One can get so attached to one expression or the other, then one forgets the whole largeness of what is undertaken. So, this is almost a fundamental requirement in any serious teaching, that one undertake more and more impartial and deep self-inquiry. Many other words get used. Always keep in mind, we are now trying to say something in English. Many of these teachings are ancient, they are not in English, different languages. But even in English, the language that Krishnamurti would use for certain expressions is not necessarily what somebody else would use, although they're using English, both of them. So certain phrases, certain ideas get emphasized. For example, I just simply give you an example. Krishnamurti was always speaking about the religious mind. And I remember even saying to him that as far as I can see, contemporary understanding of a religious mind is somebody who is fanatic, obsessed with something, and is completely sectarian. That has become the general understanding of the religious mind. But for him, that's not the meaning of the religious mind. In fact, he said, well, if people use it wrongly, doesn't mean we have to go along with them. So I even said, why don't you call it the spiritual mind rather than the religious mind? But I'm simply giving this as an example. We don't need to be arguing about it, because every teacher, every teaching has a specific way of expressing something, emphasizing something. If we are at all seriously wishing to understand any teaching, we need to not to be so much arguing about this, but trying to understand what are they hinting at. Expression of truth is not the truth. It is therefore actually very desirable if one can have more than 2 expressions of the truth, or 3 or 4. Then it can more free us from not getting stuck with one expression. This is the trouble with all religions, as far as I can see. And sadly, the same thing has become to a large extent in the Guruji Foundation, in the Krishnamurti Foundation, every other foundation. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm happily saying this loudly, so that it can actually be those who take the teaching seriously need to question the teachings so that it can become our own. All of these great teachers, including Krishnamurti, including Guruji, including Christ, including the Buddha, whenever they have a chance, they insisted not to simply believe what they are saying. They are suggesting many quite remarkable things. But we need to see, how does it apply to me? If I take anything seriously, I need to question it. Otherwise, it will never become my own. It's actually an expression of taking something seriously, that you don't easily agree. Easy agreement is simply saying, well, okay, we'll think about it some other day. Today we just accept. So don't easily accept what anybody says. So this fundamental or radical transformation of oneself requires serious, deep, impartial self-study. Otherwise, how would I know? What do I need to be free of? What is it that stands in my way? I am, you are, everybody is, at any given moment, the end product of our entire past life, including religious background, language background. Increasingly, there is a lot of data now actually gathered. In fact, Yehudi Menwin had started this several decades ago, because he was, some of you would know Yehudi Menwin, a child prodigy in music in England, but he was very interested also in Indian music. So he often played with Ravi Shankar, for example. And then he began to discover that there is something fundamentally different coming from European music to Indian music. Then he started this. Some of his followers have pursued this. Now it has become a fairly rigorous scientific study. If one grows up listening to Chinese music rather than, let us say, European music, that one's brain structure is changed. So why would it not be changed in my case, having grown up listening to Indian music, speaking Hindi? English is not my mother tongue. I have a good excuse whenever I make mistakes. It's not my mother tongue. So, but all that has brought me where I am, what I am. Transformation sounds like a good idea, but it is resisted by all the social forces which have brought me where I am. Very strong expression of this, perhaps in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali more than anywhere else, that a fundamental klesha, a fundamental obstacle is abhinivesh, a wish to continue whatever state one is in. Addiction to the status quo. Very strong. So transformation is easily admired, not so easily undertaken. So self-study more and more impartially, 'Impartially' gradually, I would first of all, let me mention several other words that are used in English as I had started saying. Sometimes self-observation, self-inquiry, self-study, self-knowledge. These are varieties of other expressions get used. But we don't need to get stuck on one thing or the other. Personally, I actually prefer awareness, self-awareness. Simple reason for that. Inquiry, at least the usual usage of that in the English language, is as if I am doing it. Awareness also has a sense of receiving something, not only just doing something, not only coming from me. But you don't need to necessarily buy this idea. I personally prefer self-awareness rather than self-inquiry. Krishnamurti almost always used the phrase self-inquiry. Then why undertake this? The fundamental idea behind that is that whatever I become aware of changes in its quality and in its relationship with me. I will take some time to stay with this idea because this is really almost the basis of my talk this morning. It was titled Self-Inquiry and Self-Transformation. I would have preferred self-awareness and self-transformation, but I wanted to use the phrase that Krishnamurti uses. First of all, the kind of knowledge or inquiry or study or awareness we are speaking about is really the only kind which in fact influences or affects the knower. Not the kind of knowledge where it doesn't make any difference on the knower. No spiritual teaching is especially interested in that kind of knowledge. One may be interested, but as I gave this example the other day, slightly in passing, whether E is equal to mc square or mc cube, it's not going to change anything in the way I live. The kind of awareness or logic or knowledge that these spiritual teachers are speaking about is knowing and being are spirally included. This is actually, I ended up almost without realizing quoting Plotinus. That's exactly what he says. Knowing and being are the same thing. Otherwise, it's not the kind of knowledge that is of any interest from the point of view of the spiritual teachings. Then, if I become aware of something or know something, don't get stuck on one word or the other, it actually changes in its quality. Simple example, one can try right now. We are breathing all the time. In general, most of us are not aware of our breath. If you take a few moments to be aware of your breath, the quality of your breathing will change. Then it will have a different effect on your body. For example, medical doctors say that an adult breathes from 13 to 18 times a minute. This has to be, these adults obviously have no self-awareness. I cannot imagine anybody who has even the remotest self-awareness breathing more than 8 or 9 times a minute. But the standard medical data is what I just mentioned. So you see, awareness is the mechanism of transformation. But that means, if one is serious about it, one would see that in everything there are many levels. It's easy to jump to the highest, but in practice it's not a very good idea. One needs to be where one actually is, and then one sees that one's awareness itself has different levels, different qualities, different intensity, different duration. And anybody who seriously undertakes this will soon realize, if I wish to bring attention to anything, in a few minutes one would realize, oh my God, I was supposed to be paying attention to something. Don't take my word for it. So awareness itself has qualities or levels, and then one begins to be more and more interested in how do I enhance the quality of awareness. And what stands in the way usually is I see something about myself, if I like it, I'm happy to announce it to my friends. If I don't like it, right away I wonder how I can either not let anybody see it or how can I change it. Then I come down to the level where the functions are actually taking place. Namely, my mind is thinking something, my feeling is doing something. Awareness belongs to a level of consciousness subtler than or higher than the functions. Take a moment to be clear about this. First of all, to give a very simple, very external kind of example, we have now increasing amount of data being gathered, what is generally called near-death experiences. Somebody who has died, and as far as one can determine their brain is completely dead, then sometimes after a few hours, few minutes, sometimes even really quite longer time, they come back alive. And during that time, there was clearly consciousness or awareness. Some of these words I keep using back and forth, again saying don't get stuck with one or the other. It sometimes can even be expressed as their perception continues, their attention continues, or they are able to be more conscious or more aware. No need to be stuck on it. We can, when it is necessary, we can be much more precise. But at present, since I'm trying to say many things fairly quickly, so the suggestion then is that consciousness can exist without functions. The brain is dead. The person comes back, he can even tell you what the doctor said to the nurse or said to the other doctor. Also, in general, for most of us, functions exist without much consciousness. What does this mean? The moment, if I am aware of something which I like or I don't like, and I come down to the same level, approving, disapproving, wanting to change it, then whatever degree of consciousness I had, now I come down to the level of the functions. This is actually a statement of Einstein in connection with physics problems, but I'm using it here then to make a generalization. He actually said that a problem cannot be solved at the same level at which it originates. He was mentioning this in the context of physics, but this is even more radically true in terms of levels of consciousness. No transformation can take place by an energy at the same level at which the problem is taking place. So, as long as I can remain a little separate from the functions, whether I like them or I don't like them, I'm just watching, I'm just aware, not wanting to change them, not wanting to inform everybody about them, depending on what kind of function it is. Then, during that time, I am in touch with a level of consciousness which is higher than the functions. Therefore, the possibility that the quality of those functions can change. Just slightly repeating it, but really more or less summarizing it, it is important for a real transformation to take place that I don't get occupied with the idea that I must transform this, I must change this. Whether I like it or I don't like it, this is what it is. I suffer the fact that that is what I am. Suffer here has the meaning also to stay with it. This is what I am. Rather than, oh, I should change it. I see I'm being very selfish, so I should change it. No, if I can actually stay watching, aware that I am selfish, slowly that changes. I invite you to try this in practice, because in a way I'm now making for some of you maybe very theoretical remark. For some of you it may be absolutely obvious, so it doesn't need to be said. So that's the problem. It's either completely obvious or completely obscure, but we have to try this. So what is the mechanism of transformation? Awareness. If you know any other mechanism, I'll be happy to learn. Let me give another example. A child at the age of 6 or 7 may be assaulted. Sadly, these are not uncommon occurrences. Even 30 years later, that assault has lodged in the memory and the body of the child. But sheer survival mechanism requires amnesia, so the child doesn't even remember what took place. But it has an effect. Maybe the child is unable to have a good job or unable to have proper relationship with the opposite gender, depending on the nature of the assault. So supposing one ends up then having to see a psychiatrist, and the extraordinary possibility that one might find a good psychiatrist. What does the psychiatrist do? Initially, perhaps just making them comfortable, which could be done by simply having them saying nice phrases or letting them relax, quieten down, or even to give them some drug that they bodily relax. But eventually, until the psychiatrist is in fact able to make them aware of what took place, they cannot be free of that. I give this only as another example, but as I said, if you know any other mechanism of transformation, I will be happy to learn. Then, if one at least temporarily takes this idea seriously, that self-awareness is the avenue of, or the mechanism of self-transformation, which is being recommended by all the teachers and all the teachings, then naturally one would be more interested in cultivating as much as one can the quality of awareness. So it becomes a very interesting shift in one's journey. The fact that I see is much more important than what I see. Take a moment. Because what I see is absolutely endless. The whole Prakriti, we would say in Sanskrit, but the whole world, whole nature is manifested in us. This is a very common standard idea. Maybe let me mention that also. Not to get too carried away with it, but very repeated idea in many serious teaching that the entire external cosmos in principle can be mirrored inside us. In fact, in the traditional yoga literature, this is the avenue to studying natural science. If I wish to study the solar system, Patanjali would recommend what part in the body needs to be focused on. This was a very important central idea, that the entire external universe can in principle be mirrored inside us. Then, if that is so, if I am focusing on something outside or whatever I see, it's endless. But if I am more interested in transformation, my interest shifts to the fact that I see. That is more important than what I see, because it's endless what I see. But that I see, then see or become aware of, as I said, don't get occupied with one phrase or the other. The fact that I see, then naturally I become more and more interested in the quality of seeing. And how to enhance that. It requires more than anything else a very deep-seated inner relaxation. Which is assisted perhaps initially simply by certain ideas. We don't need to be against ideas. But what actually moves us more than anything else are the feelings, not the ideas. In fact, the very word emotion, its root means that's what sets us into motion. That's the root of that word. But ideas can assist. If I can remind myself about the vastness of the universe, trillions of galaxies, and the obvious fact that I did not create myself. Some of you may imagine that you did, but I am quite clear. I did not create this breathing apparatus, nor the air that I need to breathe to stay alive. Then, in addition to these facts that I just mentioned, all the sages throughout human history have said, and all the great scientists and philosophers, that the whole space is filled with subtle and conscious energies. Einstein just calls it the cosmic intelligence. He has a very lovely remark. Human beings, vegetables, and cosmic dust. He puts them all together. All dancing to the tune of an invisible piper. Not a negligible scientist. This is Einstein. Naturally, religiously oriented people would say the whole space is filled with the Holy Spirit, or with Brahma, or with Allah or whatever other labels. Don't get stuck on any of these labels. But what is being conveyed, that the whole space, including this room, is filled with subtle and conscious energies. Just for simplicity, if I simply use the phrase Holy Spirit is right here. And the suggestion from all the teaching, naturally always using slightly different language, different emphasis, all this is to be expected. But the emphasis in general is that because these forces and energies are subtler than I am, more conscious than I am, I cannot command them. Can I become available to them? Can I receive them? Therefore, attitude of welcoming, inviting, prayer, these are the various expressions one would find. Can I invite them to, if you like, use this organism, this body-mind, as the tool of their will, not of my will. This is the fundamental suggestion. Language varies, expressions vary, but we don't need to get trapped by that. Yes?
I had a question about awareness, because I feel like I know someone who's very self-aware that thinks he isn't capable of change. So would another tool, since you mentioned the word will, be another tool for transformation? Because I feel like even if you're aware, sometimes there's a pessimism or a skepticism to transform based on behavior pattern or whatever. So I feel like, is will part of that equation? Or are you saying is awareness step one? Or sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off right there.
Well, if you know any other mechanism, that will be helpful. The fact that this guy...
Will, I guess was called.
Yeah.
Saying will would be another mechanism.
Well, that is, of course, again, if I am aware of what is standing in my way, then I would undertake the appropriate requirement. If more will is required or submission is required, depending on what is required. If I become aware, then I would use the corresponding tool or the corresponding requirement. Yeah? Then let me actually here, I will give you one or two examples. One actually remark of Krishnamurti himself, one personal experience of mine in meeting Krishnamurti. Little slight background. In the fall of 1965, I had just graduated from Toronto University, finishing my PhD in physics. I was going back to India. I was married in Canada also, so my wife and I went there. My wife had been a Canadian volunteer in India in 1961 to 63, and she had never heard of Krishnamurti, but she was placed in the Rajghat. Rajghat is in Varanasi. Some of you would know all this because, I mean, in a way it's obvious, but maybe if you don't know, it's a part of Varanasi, just extended part of Varanasi. And there is a very wonderful Krishnamurti school in Rajghat. She had never heard of this, but she had graduated in physical and health education, so she was asked to go there as a volunteer to teach physical education and also English. They just assume everybody who speaks English can teach English. But we were in Delhi for a few days, and earlier when she had gone, she had met Mrs. Shivarao. Yeah, Shivarao was his name. Yes. His wife was actually from Venice. I've forgotten her name now. Venetian. In any case, she just wanted to give some gift to Mrs. Shivarao. For I don't know why she could not go herself, but she asked me if I would go. And I had been in Canada where I had never even used a bicycle, but coming back to India, this is 1965, so I had a bicycle. So I went there. And so as I entered the place, it's a large house. Somebody is sitting on the porch. And as you know, rich home owners in India have chowkidars. So I assumed it was a chowkidar. Translate. Oh, chowkidar. Guard. Okay. Sorry, I thought just everybody would know this word. So somebody was sitting on a chair there, very quietly. So I asked him if Mrs. Shiva Rao is in there. He said, I'm not sure, so I'll go and check. So he goes inside and checks and comes back and says, she's not here, but she's expected in about half an hour. If you wish, you can sit here. And I keep looking at this man. Amazing presence. Very tall. But coming from Canada, one has a different relationship with time. I could not wait for half an hour. In India, it would be perfectly okay. But, but I had just come from Canada. You people don't realize how influenced we are by everything that we encounter. So I didn't want to wait. But I kept looking at him, and I'm going on my bicycle. I run into a woman who was carrying something on her head, and I fall down from my bicycle. But I kept looking back at him. In any case, a few months later, I think it was actually spring of 1966, we went to Rajghat because she had taught there, and Achyut Patvardhan, who was at that time rector of that place, or whatever the phrase is, president or something, he had taken some pity on her because she was eating in the residence, and so occasionally he would invite her to have dinner with him and more or less treated her as his daughter. So now, only the Indians can appreciate this point. Now, I was actually the son-in-law. I don't think Westerners quite understand what this means. A son-in-law in India is just a little below the gods. We have one son-in-law here, he can tell you this. This is just cultural. So, there were many people who were very eager to see Krishnamurti or whatever, but since I was obviously the son-in-law of Achyut Patvardhan, so he asked me if I would like to meet Krishnamurti. I could hardly say no. But first of all, I should also say, I had never heard of him either. But when this lady who went back from India to study, to do Master of Social Work, because she was going to come back to India and do social service here, that was her intention. I was doing a PhD in physics there, so we met there. One thing led to another, and we got married. And then, this is how I was the son-in-law, as I said. She asked me if I had heard of Krishnamurti, which I had not heard of Krishnamurti. So I heard about him through a Canadian, interestingly. And at that time, absolutely no book of Krishnamurti was, whether it was published or not, nothing was available in the whole large city of Toronto. We could find only in the Theosophical Society one photocopy, you know, that wet kind of photocopying they used to do in the 1960s. One article, that's right. That was the only thing. But on the other hand, even having read that and whatever I heard from her, I was quite not only happy to meet him, I was actually eager to meet him. So I was given 4 p.m. I was supposed to meet him next day. Starting about 3 p.m., I had a great turmoil inside me. I was absolutely agitated, surprised, even sweating. I'm going back and forth. I have no idea from where. Suddenly, it was absolutely clear to me that the reason for all this internal turmoil was that I wanted to wow Krishnamurti with my question. And when I saw this, also something was very clear, that even if he represented the combined wisdom of the Buddha and the Christ, even he or nobody could really seriously answer any of my real questions, that they had to come from deep within myself. I was absolutely clear, totally calm, quiet. Exactly at 4 o'clock, the door opens. Now, I should tell you, we started a few minutes late here. Krishnamurti would be very upset about this. If anybody was really obsessed about punctuality, it was Krishnamurti. I think it may be he was trying to correct the Indian attitude to this. Just a simple example, we had a meeting with about 10 people in New York on one occasion, and in New York City, you can be sure, you can't completely guarantee that you'll get there exactly on time. He was probably no more than 5 minutes late, but it took at least 10 minutes to apologize for being 5 minutes late. He was very concerned about punctuality. Are there many people here who actually had met him? I'm sure you would agree with what I'm saying here. So precisely at 4 o'clock, the door opens, and he ushers me in. And he actually asked me, "What can I do?" I said, "Nothing, I just wanted to look at you." I was so completely calm, so we just sat on a divan. He sat on one end and I sat on the other end. We just sat, looking at each other. But I think after a few minutes, you must have recognized this. Perhaps my mind was not quite as quiet, agitated. So then he asked me something or the other, and I then thought I should now ask him something, even though I was quite clear that any serious question nobody could really answer other than myself. But then I thought, well, here I am. So I actually asked him, "What happens after death?" He said, "But you don't know anything about life. Why worry about death?" Then we had some conversation. I told him that I have just finished a PhD, and people imagine I am an educated man, but I don't feel that I know anything real. I was quite clear about it. That interested him. So we spoke about many things. Then at that time, the river Ganga, his place is overlooking the river Ganga. Some of you may have seen it. Well, I know Professor Krishna lives there, and so he knows what I'm talking about. And it was more or less in full spate. Actually, that was almost the first time I really understood why it is regarded so sacred there. When it is full spate, it's a very grand river. And there were dark clouds, and a white bird was flying around. In between, it was sometimes covered, sometimes. So Krishnamurti takes me to the window. We stand there, and he has his hand on my shoulder, and we are looking. He says, life is just like that bird. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't see it. And then he said, "I'm certain we will meet again." So I mention this here. What is that awareness that causes that radical shift in my whole agitation? And a deep clarity that if I really have a serious question, it will become a quest in my life, and I alone can in fact respond to it. Now, I give you an example that Krishnamurti himself told me on a walk just outside here. He said, "I used to be very shy. I'm still very shy, but it used to be much worse," he said. And he said, one day, and he said, "I used to come where I had to give public talks." As you know, he had to start giving public talks very early on. And that I would stand there trembling. Then he said, "One day I saw the sheer absurdity of it. Then that completely changed." Now, you see, I saw or I became aware of or I recognized don't get stuck with one word or the other. But the point I'm trying to make, giving my own example, Krishnamurti's reference to his own, suggesting that he used to be much worse than I am now, he said, that a direct, serious perception actually has a transforming effect. I use the word perception here. Earlier I was using the word awareness, so don't get stuck on this word or that word. But now I want to raise one or two questions here, because there is a very strong... Krishnamurti has said so many wonderful things. This is actually part of the problem, because he speaks, listening to him, at least in many instances, is like listening to Gandharva music, celestial music. It is almost surprising that one is not touched by it. But there he is on the mountain top, playing the celestial music. It touches one. One can hardly not be called. Then I find saying to myself, well, okay, I have to learn do, re, mi. That's not quite clear. How? Because part of that Gandharva music is no time is required, no effort is required. Various phrases get used. For example, effort is an abomination, Krishnamurti says. Then we can justify it by saying, well, what he means is egotistic effort. But where the hell am I going to start? I am full of ego. That's where I'm going to start. I cannot start from Mount Everest, where he is. I need to start precisely where I am, full of myself, egotistic. Then sometimes I see. Sometimes something is a little freed. That's the whole meaning of seeing or awareness. Then something shifts in me. I see there are some people here, maybe not many, but at least 3 or 4, who have heard him, seen him for 40 years, 30 years, 20 years. Can they honestly say nothing has changed in them? Or can they honestly say now they have actually come to the same Mount Everest where Krishnamurti was? Neither of this can honestly be said by anybody. So in these 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, something has changed. Why be so much against time? One needs to always come back to where I am, where one is. Gandharva music is wonderful. It actually calls one. I'm actually almost surprised anybody listening to Krishnamurti or could not be touched by this. But how do I learn to play the scale? Then one would recognize, whatever the theory anybody may say, that there are many levels of one's ego. Earlier I said, this whole idea that the whole external universe can be mirrored inside oneself. Why not the devil? He's also part of the universe. The devil is also inside me. To imagine that I can be wholly free of the ego would seem completely strange. One needs to find the place of the devil. This is actually even the remark of the Buddha we were quoting just this morning. In this very body you can discover all the demons and all the gods. Question is, everything has a place. No action can be undertaken from wherever I am, and that is, I have ego. What else? You guys may be more angelic and are free of the ego. I'm talking just ordinary person. We need to begin precisely from where we are. I can't begin from where Krishnamurti is. Even where Krishnamurti came to, his own description, or people who were around him, his brother mentioning, that was not his situation a few incarnations ago. It was not his situation right in the beginning when Leadbeater found him. He was obviously already extraordinary, but some very radical transformation took place after that. So why fantasize that one is always there? He wasn't always there. So I raise some of these things here. If one is going to be honestly aware of what is actually taking place, it assists transforming something. Listening to these great sages is very helpful. As I said, I would go out of my way to listen to celestial music. But then one also needs to see what are the steps I need to take to come to this Mount Everest from where this character is talking. I had actually many other things to say, but considering it has taken me already an hour practically, I'll be very happy to have an exchange. Don't believe everything I say or anything anybody says. We need to question it. If you take anything seriously, it needs to be questioned. Very simple example, no child actually becomes strong without wrestling with his father, without racing with his father. That's what we need to do. So, feel absolutely free to disagree, because that would be help. Not argument, but more, unfortunately, quoting Krishnamurti is very nice, quoting Guruji is very nice. No, what have I actually tried? What have I found?
Ravi, you said that the whole of the cosmos is filled with conscious energy. What is conscious energy? Energy I understand. What do you mean by conscious energy?
That's a very helpful question, partly because in physics, here I'm talking to a professor of physics, we use the word energy and we can speak about several kinds of energy, but always the underlying understanding that they are in principle interconvertible. In the process we may lose some energy, etc., but in principle they are interconvertible. The phrase, when is used in some teachings, perhaps much more strongly in Guruji's teaching, there they are speaking about levels of energy, by which they mean different levels of consciousness, which is not the way we use the word energy in physics. What is happening, particularly this is my impression about Guruji's teaching, they were rather eager to bring ancient teaching. There is nothing new that Guruji is saying that you cannot find in all classical teachings. But he wishes to express this for the modern mind. And the modern mind is influenced by science, especially in the Western world even more so, but even in India increasingly, much more by science and technology than by any other feature. So he therefore tries to use this scientific kind of language, more particularly more or less early 20th century scientific language. Even that would now have to be changed because of quantum mechanics, etc. However, that aside, but the expression there has more to do with levels of energy. By level, one meaning levels of consciousness. So that's the suggestion.
I was going to add one other point to it.
Please.
That there is
Can you have the microphone here? No, but I think they are transmitting it for people. Say,
because The way when we're observing the universe, we've noted that the rate at which the universe is expanding cannot be explained by the energy that we see. That's why there's things like dark matter and dark energy. And people think it's somewhere else, but it's here in this room too. So 2/3 of the universe we can't see. But 2/3 of what's in this room, we have no idea what it is. And that's a scientific, very clearly we know today. So that takes us to unknowable. We know what it does in some ways in terms of the rate of expansion of universe, but we really don't know what it is.
There are many things we don't know.
And and I want to point out that that's this room. What's in this room, 2/3 of what is in this room, we don't know. We can't see and we don't know, but it has its effects. And that's what the scientists are telling us today. So
This might actually interest people as a historical note. Almost everything we these days teach in physics is 120 years old. So give some credit to our smart scientists that in next 120 years they will find something, or 1200 years they will find something. So to imagine that now we know everything will be quite crazy. This is always, that is a very strong attitude. I give an example of this. Almost everybody, even people who are not scientists, would perhaps know the name of Lord Kelvin. We measure absolute temperature, so many kelvins. He was president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And he retired, I believe, in 1896. Maybe a year more or less, but something like that. And in his retirement address, he gives a great elaboration about wonderful discoveries made in physics in the 19th century. I can assure you there are many quite remarkable. For example, that light is an electromagnetic wave is not an easy, obvious thing. This was a great discovery. So after listing all these great discoveries, he says, I have only one regret left, that the future physicists have nothing left to discover. Everything we now teach in physics is since then. 1895, Marie Curie published her paper on radiation. 1900, first paper in quantum mechanics by Max Planck. 1905, special theory of relativity by Einstein. 1911, Niels Bohr model of the atom. 1915, the general theory. I could give you the whole history of physics that follows from this.
Just one comment here, Ravi, most probably you can help us with that. Is like, what exactly it means by being self-aware? I know in Gurdjieff's way we call it the second conscious shot. But what exactly is, and maybe it'll be good to elaborate, just this observation, what you're talking about, being awareness, self-awareness. What exactly is that and what's the process? Maybe you could lead with some exercise to people so it gets clear. Because sometimes it becomes like a more of a mental exercise otherwise.
It's not to make it a mental exercise, it's good to try right now. For everybody, it's likely to be different for each person. If I am saying something, can I at the same time be a little aware whether I'm saying something, for example, to look smart, to somehow get away with some question answer, or am I trying to actually inquire something? Do I really know what I'm saying? So if I can become aware of all that background, I'm still talking. Self-awareness does not remove action. However, it is recommended often, especially initially, because action has a tendency to externalize our attention, that it is easier initially when one is practicing to try to do this thing more in quieter moments. sometimes other expressions get used, especially since you mentioned Gurdjieff teaching. There, the expression would be self-remembering. It's not remembering in the sense of remembering something historical. It's closer to, actually, Mrs. Welch made this very interesting remark. Generally, our self is dismembered. It is remembering the self, integrating the self, seeing its integrity. So, but there are other expressions used by Gurdjieff for the same thing, namely consciousness of being. That when I say Ravi is speaking, who is speaking? The instrument, or is some quality of consciousness which has taken on this body? It's not easily solved questions, but this will be the direction. Quelqu'un autre? Yes.
Along the same lines of self-awareness and transformation. It seems that transformation, in my understanding, is quite radical and is sort of non-reversible. When I think about self-awareness, for example, the example you used for becoming aware of your breath, I can do that momentarily. Maybe it is in that moment for a few seconds a minor change. It has no transformation. It is nearly as if I have a little bit of self-awareness of something, but then it slips easily away. It is like an elastic. I come right away back to myself, to my conditioning, to my ego. So where does the self-awareness for those little things, temporary things, which may be temporary little changes, where does the self-awareness or self-remembering, if I focus on my inner and know and see and feel that what's inside here is here and has been here forever? It's the same thing as when I was 1 year old, 5 years old, 10 years old. It's the same being sort of inside me, what is there, whatever that is. Can I remember myself in that way? But even that, when I lose that grip on that sort of way of thinking, nearly, of being, I don't know what it is, it's gone too, and I fall back again on the ordinary person who I am. So how can self-awareness, in whatever form it is, can it be practiced as an exercise, so you can build a muscle? Or how can it eventually indeed lead to a radical transformation of myself?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is the reason I had said that if I get more and more persuaded that there is some meaning to this, then one becomes actually more interested in the quality of one's awareness rather than whatever I am aware of. And then what you just said, that ordinarily I am aware of something for just as my breath, but then I'm no longer aware of it, and the breathing just comes back to my usual breathing. If my awareness is considerably more steady, the kind of expression which you sometimes hear in religious literature, for example in Song of Songs, although I was asleep but my heart was awake. We could dismiss this easily, sounds just romantic, but it is actually possible, even though I'm engaged in many things here, there, I'm not in that sense specially paying attention to, let us say, my breathing or anything else that I wish to be aware of. but there is, if you like, a background awareness that continues. That itself requires a fair amount of practice. So, but what is behind what I'm trying to say is, if I become interested that the quality of awareness is what I need to be enhancing. Usually what happens with us is the seduction of seeing many things. And it's endless. But staying with a few things, but enhancing the way I see it, or the quality of seeing it, then it has, if you like, slightly more longer lasting influence. You can look at anybody who has seriously practiced yoga with any awareness, I guarantee they do not breathe more than 7 or 8 times a minute. Why? What has changed? But that is, I just took the example of breathing. If I see that I am jealous or competitive, to see it once, okay, maybe that moment I won't be, but that doesn't radically change something in me. If I can stay with it, suffer the fact that that's what I am, rather than immediately wanting to change it. No. Enhancing this awareness that I am jealous or competitive or greedy, whatever. You don't need to buy what I say, but if you try, I can say that it will actually change something in you. But simply to accept it or reject it, that's not going to help. This is the difficulty with anything practical, that one has to. It is certainly true, as I have earlier given example of great remarks of Krishnamurti, but sometimes it doesn't have to be Krishnamurti. We hear a piece of music which we find very touching, and it touches something. In fact, I remember a very long conversation with Krishnamurti on this very topic, that every impression changes our body at a cellular level. Now, naturally, it would also depend on the quality of the impression, the intensity of it, the depth of it. You see what I'm saying? But I'm making a general remark that every impression. So then, if I am very touched by a concert, or I stand in front of a work of art which touches me, you think then it's finished? Does it leave absolutely no residue in me? I'm actually inviting you to consider this seriously. I had a very long conversation with Krishnamurti on it, and he in fact very much agreed with this. It's a whole long story. I don't have time now to go into this, but in this very room, every impression changes our body at a cellular level. The trouble with us usually is we have contradictory impressions going on all the time. And one of the reasons why our whole society is going increasingly crazy, because there are terrible impressions everywhere. If we were careful about our own children, etc., we would wish them to have impressions which are worthwhile, if you like. What kind of paintings they look at it, whether they have a visit to the natural fields, in the wilderness, what kind of music they hear. All this will change their whole character. Anybody else wishes to say something? Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. There's a term which I don't want to confuse called the witnessing self, the part that's just watching. Is that what you were referring to as awareness?
Essentially.
Okay, thank you.
There is a little bit of a difference here. Let me say, I don't know whether you were necessarily taking it from right in the oldest text in any Indo-European language, in the Rig Veda, there is this remark that there are two birds on the same one tree. Were you taking it from there?
No.
No. Okay. Because there the idea is that one bird is always a witness. And the other word, sorry, not word, other bird, you see, I told you English is not my mother tongue. The other bird is involved in action, etc. A little difference in my understanding that even this witnessing bird has qualities of witnessing, qualities of awareness. The expression there doesn't convey that. It's just as if that bird is just permanently something. So that's the reason I was wondering whether you were coming from that.
I appreciate that. Is the bird who is doing aware of the bird that is watching? Sometimes.
Usually not. Okay, anybody else?
Where does awareness come from?
You know, it's very interesting that there are certain words. For example, if we were seriously trying to describe what is beauty, we would have great difficulty. But in any gathering, we can gradually begin to agree, this is beautiful, this is not beautiful. Or this is even more beautiful. You see what I'm saying? Same thing is true with many other words like this. I remember a remark of St. Augustine, as long as nobody asks me what time is, I'm very clear. If somebody asks what time is, suddenly one is not clear. So many of these words like awareness, consciousness, etc., we can be aware of levels of consciousness. It's easier to recognize them within ourselves and sometimes in others, but it becomes very difficult to define consciousness. Then, of course, one makes an attempt at it. One then ends up slightly circular. Well, consciousness is what allows me to be aware. Then I can pay attention. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. There is a kind of a circularity, but if you look at any dictionary, that's what a dictionary does. A dictionary gives you an English word for another English word. Right? Or many. Yeah? So it creates, but then in the process, you either give up or you begin to have a little clarity of what's taking place. But that's what a dictionary does. Yes, Pam.
Did Krishnamurti say anything about the different ashrams of life in the Hindu tradition?
Different what?
Did Krishnamurti say anything about the different ashrams of life in the Hindu tradition, where there is an ashram at a certain age, one leaves one's home and goes to the forest to pursue a spiritual path, enlightenment, whatever. What did he say about that?
I'm actually now going to submit to my friend here who is much more knowledgeable about what Krishnamurti said than I am.
Then don't depend on any ashrams and any gurus. Find out for yourself. But I have a question now that I have this in my hand. You mentioned that the necessity of awareness for transformation, but doesn't it have to be coupled with some element of inquiry? Because you can just be watching and witness watching without any inquiry, then you won't come to any transformation.
No, inquiry, in my judgment, is actually included. It's almost like a subset of awareness. This is why I said earlier that the word could be self-inquiry, self-knowledge, self-study, self-awareness. Because many of these words, actually, again, if you go to the dictionary, you would see one is used to describe the other. And
generally speaking, you need observation, and it has to be coupled with some inquiry or query or question. Then learning takes place.
Yes.
Otherwise, you can just watch a cloud go by, and it's nice to look at it, but hardly any learning. But if you ask a question, why does it move? Then you start learning.
I am actually afraid that I have to say here, Krishnamurti would not agree with you.
Yeah, it doesn't matter, do you?
Because at least the example that you gave, that's really the nature of the scientific inquiry.
But here also you're trying to discern what is true and what is false.
There, it is not a question of my raising this question. In fact, he actually even explicitly makes this remark. If I am inquiring for something, it has to be already slightly determined by my mind. Therefore, I cannot come to the unknown.
No, but with awareness, no. So
Awareness. That is the requirement.
if you have no question, then what? You will just see what you...
Questioning, now you see here, this is it's an interesting thing for us to, by the way, we are old friends. No. We have actually a general understanding that we can happily disagree and remain friends. Now, inquiry can be, as it were, raising a question which has an answer. Inquiry can also be, how can my mind become more and more open? We may therefore begin to call it awareness, that it encounters whatever it encounters. So there is a difference between these two phrases, and what I may be wrong. My impression is Krishnamurti was much more actually, although he often used the word self-inquiry, but he is much more interested in drawing our attention to something that we don't know, about which we don't have any kind of terminology, the complete unknown.
Otherwise, how you go to unknown? If you start asking questions, get your thoughts involved, unknown is not going to be there.
Maybe curiosity could be a word rather than inquiry. Curiosity.
Curiosity, maybe.
Instead of a
Yeah.
question.
Wonder.
Yes. Wonder, a sense of wonder. We better make it the last one because he's going to get mad at me.
So the awareness part, would it be the same thing as saying, trying to be in the present moment as much as we can? Would it be the same thing, or is it totally different?
No, it'll be the same thing, so that my mind is not thinking of yesterday or tomorrow. It's right here. Whatever comes.
Power of now.
Thank you very much. Oh, you're very welcome, sir.
That's the difference between the traditional Krishnamurti students and yourself. A different one, because some of them would hour and hour will argue and make up these questions.